There comes a moment so quiet, it almost doesn't feel real. No fight, no dramatic goodbye, no last desperate paragraph sent at 2:11 in the morning. Just a strange stillness, where your hands stop reaching for the phone, your chest stops negotiating with absence, and something inside you finally gets too tired to keep bleeding in the same place. That is the moment they feel. Not always immediately, not in the way you expect. Avoidant people are not usually struck by loss in the same instant as everyone else. Their system is built for delay, for distance, for emotional anesthesia. While you were drowning in the confusion, wondering why warmth could turn cold overnight, they were already retreating into a place inside themselves where feelings become static, where closeness feels like pressure, where love can feel less like comfort and more like being trapped under something heavy. So when you stop chasing, it does not look dramatic on the outside. But inside them, something shifts. And that shift is the part no one tells you about. Because the brutal truth is this: as long as you keep reaching, they do not have to face what they are losing. As long as you keep explaining, forgiving, understanding, waiting, circling back, reading between silences, translating crumbs into hope, they can stay inside the illusion that the connection is still there whenever they want it, that you are still emotionally parked outside their door, that they can disappear without consequence and return without grief. Your pursuit becomes their emotional cushion. Your pain becomes their escape route. And the hardest part is that you called it love. You called it patience, depth, loyalty. You told yourself that if you could just be gentle enough, soft enough, non-threatening enough, they would eventually feel safe enough to stay. But what if the thing keeping this pattern alive was not your love, but your refusal to let the loss become real for them? What if every time you rushed in to repair the distance, you rescued them from the one experience that might have forced their nervous system to wake up? This is why the moment you truly give up feels so different. Because giving up is not the same as pretending to detach so they chase you. They can feel the difference. An avoidant person has spent a lifetime reading emotional pressure. Their body is trained to detect need, expectation, conflict, vulnerability that feels too close, too fast, too consuming. Their amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for threat, doesn't always distinguish between danger and intimacy. To someone with avoidant defenses, closeness can register as a loss of control. Their nervous system reads your love, your need for reassurance, even your sadness, and translates it into pressure. Cortisol rises, the body tightens. Dopamine, the chemical that once lit them up in the beginning, gets replaced by the urge to regulate through distance. So they pull away, not always because they stopped caring, but because they felt overwhelmed by caring. That is the part people miss. They think avoidants are cold because they feel nothing. But often the truth is more complicated and far more tragic. They feel too much in the wrong direction. They feel closeness as obligation. They feel tenderness as exposure. They feel your disappointment as engulfment. They feel your love, and instead of melting, they brace. Then they go quiet. Then they become vague. Then they start needing space they cannot explain. Then they act like your reaction to their withdrawal is the problem, when really your reaction is just the sound of being hurt. And for a while, this keeps working, because you stay emotionally available. You keep the thread alive. You send the check-in message. You break the silence. You leave the door cracked open. And every time you do, Their system gets relief without responsibility. They don't have to process the absence because you never let the absence fully arrive. But when you finally do, when your silence is no longer a strategy, no longer a test, no longer a wounded pause filled with hope, when it becomes real, that is when the avoidant begins to feel something they are profoundly unequipped to handle. Irreversibility. Not your anger, not your tears, not your speeches, your absence. Real absence. The kind that does not lean forward, the kind that does not ask for clarity, the kind that does not beg to be chosen, the kind that quietly removes its energy and leaves them alone with the emotional echo of what they kept refusing to hold. This is the core concept most people misunderstand. Your silence is not punishment. It is information. It tells the truth without saying a word. It says, I am no longer available for half love. It says, I cannot keep translating your fear into meaning for both of us. It says, if you want connection, you will have to meet reality without my constant emotional labor cushioning you from it. And this is usually when the avoidance starts to change. Not always outwardly at first, not always with a grand confession. Avoidant people often process in reverse. First comes distance, then numbness, then relief. Then, once the threat of intimacy is gone, the feelings they buried begin to rise from underneath the silence. Now the phone is quiet. Now you are not asking where they stand. Now they are not being pulled into emotional accountability. And strangely, that is when their body starts to have enough space to feel what was there all along. They start noticing the missing ritual, the message that used to arrive, the person who used to care enough to reach through the wall. The softness they claimed was too much becomes the warmth they cannot replace. The consistency they once took for granted begins to glow in memory. Dopamine attaches to the loss. Their mind circles back. Their nervous system, which once calmed itself by escaping closeness, begins to feel the emptiness left behind. That is when the obsession can begin. Quietly. Privately. In ways you may never even see. They check your status and pretend they didn't. They revisit old conversations. They wonder if you're speaking to someone else in the same gentle tone you once reserved for them. They replay moments they brushed off. They hear your voice in memory, but now it lands differently. Because memory is safe. Memory does not demand. Memory does not ask vulnerable questions. Memory lets them feel you without the pressure of being needed by you. And this is why, after you finally stop trying, they sometimes come back with an intensity that shocks you. Not because they suddenly became secure, not because they had a magical breakthrough overnight, but because the emotional equation changed. When you were available, closeness felt overwhelming. When you became unavailable, loss felt overwhelming. And for an avoidant person, loss often enters where intimacy was blocked. Read that again in your bones. Loss often enters where intimacy was blocked. So they begin to do things that once seemed impossible for them. They reach out randomly. They ask how you've been. They send something indirect, almost casual, as if they just happen to think of you. Sometimes they become strangely nostalgic, sometimes more affectionate, sometimes more attentive than they have been in months. Sometimes they watch from a distance, hoping you will open the door without forcing them to confront how deeply they are affected. And sometimes, yes, they chase. But not always in a clean, romantic, movie scene kind of way. Sometimes they chase through confusion, through mixed signals, through sudden intensity followed by fear, through moments of almost vulnerability that collapse into retreat. Because the same nervous system that now misses you is still the nervous system that learned to associate closeness with danger. That is why their reaction can shock you. Not because it is simple, but because it is so contradictory. They can miss you and resist you at the same time. They can long for you and fear your availability. They can come close just to prove you're still there, then panic when they realize you are no longer standing in the same place. This is the part where many people make the mistake that reopens the wound. They see the avoidant reappear, and instantly they translate it as transformation. They think, finally, now they understand my value. Finally, now they're ready. Finally, now all the pain meant something. But you have to be careful here, because absence can activate desire without creating emotional maturity. Missing you is not the same as being able to love you well. Longing is not commitment. Regret is not repair. And just because your silence forced them to feel does not mean they are suddenly capable of staying present when closeness returns. This is why breaking the pattern requires more than making them miss you. It requires refusing to become the old emotional structure they relied on. It requires not rushing in to soothe their discomfort the second they reappear. It requires not collapsing the boundary that finally made truth visible. Because if you respond from the old wound, the old cycle returns. They reach out, you melt. They feel safe again, not because intimacy became easier, but because access became easy again. The urgency fades, their defenses wake back up, and suddenly you are once again standing in the smoke, trying to decode what just happened. This is why your power was never in making them jealous, or silent, or nostalgic. Your power is in becoming unavailable to the version of love that keeps abandoning you. That is what changes everything. Imagine this. They send the message. Maybe it's soft. Maybe it's awkward. Maybe it's as small as, "Hey, I've been thinking about you." Old you would have read it like oxygen. Old you would have felt the body flood. Dopamine, hope, relief, vindication. Finally, proof, something, anything. But the new you pauses. You do not answer from hunger. You do not answer from the child inside you who still thinks being chosen is the same thing as being safe. You do not answer from the trembling place that wants to turn one message into a future. You answer, or don't answer, from self-respect. And that is the moment the power dynamic truly flips. Not when they text first, not when they watch your story, not when they say they miss you. When you are no longer internally available for confusion, that is when they feel it most. Because avoidant people are often deeply attuned to emotional access. They know when someone is still hooked. They know when they can leave the connection in a suspended state and return later. They know when your heart is still waiting in the hallway. But when they sense that you have emotionally withdrawn your investment, when your energy is no longer trembling toward them, when your life is no longer arranged around their capacity, they feel the ground move. Now your silence has weight. Now your calm has consequences. Now your detachment is not a performance, but a mirror. And in that mirror, they are finally forced to face themselves. The care they minimized, the distance they normalized, the intimacy they sabotaged, the person who loved them in a language they could not receive without fear. That realization can crack something open in them. Sometimes it becomes growth. Sometimes it becomes panic. Sometimes it becomes a restless need to get you back, not because they know how to keep you, but because your absence has become the one emotion they can no longer control. And yes, sometimes that reaction will shock you. The person who once seemed detached starts becoming watchful. The one who needed endless space starts creating reasons to reach out. The one who acted unmoved starts showing signs of ache. But the real shock should not be their reaction. It should be yours. Because by then, if you have done this right, you are no longer hypnotized by the old fantasy. You start seeing clearly. You realize how much of this bond was built on your ability to endure emotional starvation and still call it connection. You realize how often you abandoned yourself to prove you were worthy of not being abandoned by them. You realize that your obsession with being understood by them kept you from understanding the deepest truth of all. You were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person to give what they were terrified of giving. That changes a person. That ends something ancient inside you. You stop romanticizing their potential and start measuring their capacity. You stop confusing chemistry with safety. You stop translating inconsistency into hidden depth. You stop treating your intuition like an inconvenience every time it tells you that love should not feel like waiting in the dark for someone to remember your worth. And the most powerful thing happens next. You stop needing their reaction to validate your transformation. Whether they come back or not, something in you has already returned to itself. Your nervous system begins to settle. Cortisol drops. The body that once lived in anticipation begins to breathe differently. You sleep without checking. You wake without scanning. You laugh without wondering whether they would have liked the sound. Your identity slowly detaches from the role of being the one who understands, forgives, waits, explains, absorbs. You become unfamiliar to the version of yourself that thought pain was proof of love. That is real power. Not being the one they chase, being the one who no longer betrays herself for breadcrumbs. And if they do return, if they finally understand what they lost, if the silence lands on them with the force of grief, and they reach for you with trembling hands and a voice you barely recognize, let them meet someone new. Let them meet the version of you who does not confuse remorse with readiness. Let them meet the version of you who listens less to words and more to patterns. Let them meet the version of you whose heart is still deep, still tender, still capable of love, but no longer available for emotional homelessness. Because this was never just about their reaction. It was about your awakening. It was about the day you stopped standing outside locked doors, calling it devotion. It was about the day you understood that your softness is sacred, and anything that repeatedly makes it beg for basic care does not deserve access to it. It was about the day your silence stopped being pain and became self-honor. So if you are in that space now, quiet, done, almost grieving, but strangely clear, do not panic if they suddenly stir. Do not be surprised if the avoidant who seemed so certain, so distant, so unreadable, starts acting like your absence is haunting them. That is what happens when reality finally reaches someone who has spent years outrunning emotion. But do not break your own healing just because they finally felt the impact of what you felt all along. Let them feel it. Let the silence teach what your love could not. Let the distance tell the truth they kept postponing. And then, choose yourself so completely that whether they return with longing, confusion, regret, or desire, they are no longer the center of the story. You are. You, who survived being slowly erased and came back whole. You, who mistook anxiety for love and learned the difference. You, who kept handing your worth to unavailable hands and finally closed your fingers around it yourself. You, who no longer need to chase understanding from someone committed to escaping it. That is the shift. That is the ending. And that is the beginning of the life they never believed you would choose without them. A life where your heart is not a waiting room. A life where your peace is not negotiated. A life where love, when it comes, does not trigger your wounds and call it passion. A life where you are not powerful because someone finally saw your value, but because you did. And once you do, once you really do, the silence stops sounding like loss. It starts sounding like freedom.